Thank you very much. This lecture is called Thomas Gainsborough, The Substance of Style, and it's kind of a rumination, kind of a rainy afternoon set of thoughts about this painter. It's also defense of Gainsborough from some of the charges that are leveled against him. Now, one of the goals for the exhibition, we've worked very hard, is to bring England to New England this summer. And you can see upstairs in the exhibition extraordinary selection of maybe the quintessential British artist, Thomas Gainsborough. Of his art, we have some 50 portraits, including 19 full-lengths. And of these 19 full-lengths, 15 are hanging in a single room. So for the duration of the summer, this is temporarily the greatest room of British portraiture anywhere in the world. We've also tried to have a good selection of his landscapes, which is what he preferred to paint, and he really thought that was his favorite artistic subject. And we also have a selection of very beautiful drawings, and many of these are masterpieces of 18th century art. Not just British art, but masterpieces of 18th century art anywhere in the world, and many of them, of course, will be familiar. We also worked very hard to bring English period furniture, decorative arts, costumes, and musical instruments into the exhibition. And these were both to provide a general visual context and also to make very specific points about Gainsborough's style, his relationship to frame making and furniture and decorative arts, his interest in music and his interest in depicting musicians, and also Gainsborough as a painter of clothing. So I'm very happy about the results upstairs, but I will not take any credit, however, for the remarkable spate of English weather we've been enduring. That authentic British precipitation was not part of the curatorial plan. Gainsborough, as I said, wanted to be known for his landscapes. These never sold well. They were not a failure on his part, though. His landscapes were very well recommended by contemporaries. We have newspaper reviews that go on about how beautiful and grand his... How about... There we go. How about... There we go. You know what? In fact, could you actually change the one on the right's actually reversed. Could you flip that around, please? Jane, sir, thank you. Now, Gainsborough wanted to be known for his landscapes, but these didn't sell well, and instead he made his steady work as a portraitist, and that's what you had to do in the 18th century. Remember, Britain was a Protestant country, was suspicious of religious images, and if you were a young artist making your way in Italy or France or Germany, you'd probably paint religious paintings or large mythological works. In England, though, you had to do it as portraits, and there are lots of jokes about it. The only thing an Englishman wants in a picture was either his horse or his dog, and that's a kind of problem that Gainsborough really had to work with. Portraitist was being a steady work, and he was very good at it. And you see here in these two slides kind of the arc of the exhibition, and this is an early one, obviously, and then a late one. And I say obviously in the sense that when we look at painters, particularly ones that really love to manipulate paint, they start out small and tight, and they get big and loose as they go on. You see this, most impressively perhaps with Rembrandt, but you certainly see it here with Gainsborough. And this comparison is a bit forced in that these images are very different sized in real life. The one on the left is about 2 feet by 2 feet, and this is about 9 by 6, so much, much larger. But in fact, the painting itself is about as large as you'll see it there on the screen. These people do have names. The first one is the Grosvenor family. It's painted around 1750, and the one on the right is the Morning Walk, but they're actually known, they officially are Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett. This was painted in 1785, just about the time they got married. So that's about 1750, 1785, so about 35 years difference. And what you see on the left is a very contented family. Clearly, they are proud of their social status, the amount of beautiful clothes they can own. But you'll also see how kind of tight they are. I mean, it's two things. One, there's a kind of visual idea about their costumes. Know that there's this wiry line. It's kind of squirmy, the effect that goes around, and he has plopped these people down, or not even plopped them down so much as set them against a landscape. It's a generic landscape, but they don't seem particularly comfortable in it. It looks as if those clothes were not actually that comfortable, particularly the panniers on the sides of the dress, but the Grosvenor family clearly quite proud of themselves. There we go, it's a little better. And but the one on the right, you see something completely different. This is late Gainsborough. You've got also people dressed to impress, wearing fancy clothes. They even also have the sense of being at ease in the landscape, but here they're beautifully set. There's a combination of sitter and setting in the painting on the right we don't see in the left. That is, they're so well immersed into it. And part of this is done through the brushstrokes. And you see there the early brushstrokes in the early painting early Gainsborough uses very tight brushstrokes. He doesn't have a lot of visual brushstrokes. He's almost holding himself back. And a way to think about this in a way is that Gainsborough, his eye is very precise. He clearly knows the relationships in the family. He also knows that it's pretty easy to guess which person was paying for that painting, right? The tallest one, right? The dad. And also showing off things they probably would have admired, like at the far right, the shock of wheat there, which shows the agricultural prosperity of Suffolk, which is the region in southeast England where Gainsborough came from. There's a real attention to bark, and you can imagine Mr. Graver saying, well, that's a real tree. But the group, though, they seem, I think, to, somewhat stiff, and it's not just a little bit leaning over in their little dresses, but also that they seem to be sort of stuck on. There's not the ease and comfort you see in this last painting, this late painting, as the couple walk arm in arm. And as a kind of shorthand, you could say that early Gainsborough portraits look posed, and late Gainsborough portraits look poised. I think that's a real distinction, though, because people at first are looking right at us, and there's something a little earnest about it. Late Gainsborough, completely confident. And this is, on the right, what we think of as the ideal of Gainsborough, even perhaps the ideal of British portraiture. The sense of ease and entitlement, comfort, even effortlessness. Important thing is not for anything to look very hard. No one works too hard in a Gainsborough painting. Now, these two encapsulate his career, and part of the joy in the exhibition, as you can in a good retrospective show, is see how an artist develops from something like that to this. And with this kind of comparison, you'd be forgiven if you thought these were two different artists. There's certainly a change in fashion. Notice how the women's dresses go much smaller, and the men stop wearing wigs. In the early period, mostly wearing wigs. He just has powdered hair here. The hats go from little bonnets to very complicated things. The collars go up in the men. So lots of changes along that way. But the big difference, though, is one of mood. And I argue that much of the difference in mood is in the application of paint. This, what I would say, is the substance of his style. That is, the wiry line, very tight brushstrokes to the left, and then big, free brushstrokes. And the word I like to use is feathery, because on the right it seems to be that there's an equal attention of soft brushstrokes that give an overall harmonious effect that blend the sitters into the setting. I think they're blended even almost to the point of camouflage. They're so beautifully set there in the trees where you've got similar brushstrokes making up the Pomeranian sheepdog at the bottom and the foliage and the clouds and the beautiful dress. And notice she's wearing this, it's got this very gauzy, it's pretty much impossible to see in the slide, but in the original can, a very gauzy sort of scarf over her shoulders, and then cuffs, and his powdered hair, and the whole thing is just so gentle and confident. And I think that's a remarkable transformation that comes over in his art. And so you see the distinction between posed and poised, and I think that part of it's not just that the figures are sort of in action rather than posing for us, but also that Gainsborough, his eye always perceptive, but by late Gainsborough, his hand has caught up to his eye, and he's now has a manual dexterity, and that's the substance of his style, the actual application of the paint. Now, popularity in portraiture seems a bit suspicious. We often use the word facile to talk about talent. If someone is really good at making a drawing, perhaps he or she isn't really an artist. This is sort of suspicious that elegance may be unworthy. No doubt that one of the most popular portraitists in history is Rembrandt, a real warts and all portrait. But I wonder how many of us would pick Rembrandt to do our portrait rather than, say, Gainsborough. I want to go show you a beautiful slide here. This is Mrs. Graham. It comes from in Edinburgh, not in the exhibition. This painting, by its bequest, is not allowed to travel. But you see here, kind of great Gainsborough in the early 1770s, really the peak of his ability. Incredibly elegant woman, and you can see, particularly in this detail slide on the right, how loosely he's constructed what would otherwise be a pretty spiky and sharp costume. Now, she's not wearing the typical dress of the 1770s. Rather, this is a kind of Van Dyck costume. It's a little bit of a misnomer because the costume's slightly closer to those in Rubens' paintings rather than Van Dyck ones, but they're called Van Dyck costumes. And in the mid-18th century, from around 1730 to about 1780, people would wear these costumes that reflect the style of Van Dyck. Van Dyck comes to England in 1731 and 1631, that is a century before Gainsborough, completely transforms British portraiture. And in this, these costumes of the time had lots of this very beautiful collars and lots of lace, shimmery textures, and a certain nonchalance in all poses. Again, this idea of effortlessness, a kind of courtier's ideal. This very beautiful picture, but what I want to draw attention is not just to the moodiness, but actually how he makes up that. And you'll see that there's a lot of detail in it, but compared to someone like John Singleton Copley, nothing is labored, and that's very key. And I think it's fair to say that the sitter can't look relaxed if the painter isn't relaxed. That is, if it looks too hard, too much effort going into it, the whole project will seem fussy rather than effortless and elegant. And what you find interesting here is, although there is enough similarity in the brushstrokes that make up, say, the pearls, there's an amazing and indeed enviable freedom in this. I'll show you a few more details. But what I like about this, though, is it's showing that Gainsborough is having fun, and he's putting a certain burden on us as viewers to sort of complete the details in our own eyes. Now, let's go back here and go forward here just for a second, just to point out one thing that's interesting about Gainsborough is that certain poses, he's not new in this, but certain poses seem to be very effective. And clearly Mrs. Graham on the left is much, much more beautiful than John Eld on the right. But the point in that is that both of these share a similar, there we go, a little better there. Both of these have the same pose. And it shows someone not trying too hard, and in neither case looking out at us. And that's quite interesting, too. Certain Gainsborough portraits, there's a transfixing gaze or glare, but in many of his most successful ones, you see people at ease, and that's really key. These are not actually that different in date. The one on the left is about 2 years earlier than the one on the right. The one on the right is in the MFA's own collection. It's John Eld of Seaford Hall, and he was a hospital founder. This painting normally hangs in our galleries, and he was a star of the Art and Bloom celebration this April. But he's interesting because at the bottom right, you'll have to take my word for it, it's a little hard to read here, but it says, by the command and at the expense of the subscribers. And this was quite interesting because there was a committee of people that got together and paid for a picture to honor this man who founded a hospital. And in the last couple of years, there's been a spate of great research into Gainsborough, and most interestingly, they've discovered the document where this committee were all solicited to pay money in order to pay for this picture to celebrate this hospital founder. So you can think of these people as kind of hospital supporters. And interestingly, though, when you total up all the donations made by the 100 people on the committee, it doesn't quite come up to the total for the price of the painting, which meant that poor John Eld here had to top up the gift that was supposed to be in honor of him. Now, the point in this all, though, is that this man, obviously, as a major philanthropist, wasn't necessarily one to spend much of his time leaning against columns there. In fact, we know that he was extremely busy. He took his philanthropy very seriously. But the idea here is to show someone lost in thought, not working too hard. And one thing you'll see upstairs in the exhibition is that almost none of his musicians are actually playing musical instruments. It's, again, all about this idea of effortlessness, and I attest that is conveyed in the way that none of the details are painted with too much precision. There's nothing kind of distracting about that. He will have some areas that are quite precise, but indeed, the majority of a Gainsborough painting, landscape or portrait, is left somewhat rough. We'll see in a minute how late Gainsborough goes even beyond that. Now, the charge of someone's facility meaning that he's literally facile, not a serious artist, not a heavyweight, that he is literally superficial, of course, has been leveled on Gainsborough's great successor, who is John Singer Sargent, and we have on the left a Gainsborough Countess Howe masterpiece from 1763, and then on the right we have a Sargent that's here at the MFA of Mrs. Fisk Warren and her daughter from 1903. So that's a mid-period Gainsborough and a mid-period Sargent. And these are very similar, beautiful women, and they've got these shimmering surfaces, and you can see in both cases there's a real interest in the Gainsborough and in Sargent for having very slash brush strokes. The idea, not so important what the cloth is made of, but really how it reflects light. That's clearly someone that enjoys painting. Amazing detail, right? You see, it's at the left of the picture. There's a bright white line, a diagonal, and that line, in fact, is the reflection, its glare on the polished armrests of the chair. So it's extraordinary detail. It's done so quickly with maybe one or two strokes of white paint. And there's, I think, a real similarity in this, in the way these costumes were kind of slashed. It's not painted with great precision, but rather with a certain freedom. That makes it fun. It makes our eyes want to range back and forth. And we also have to think a bit about how the artist did it. I think we should think of the artist as being a magician. I'll get back to his technique in a minute, but Gainsborough is working at a certain magic here. But what's fun, though, as we go up close, we'll see these passages be very, very abstract. In fact, it's hard to figure out when you're quite close what actually something is. And then when you stand back, things spring back into focus. But Gainsborough is a kind of different magician. He's a magician in a way who doesn't mind that we get how the magic trick is done. He lets his secrets come out in front of him, and we as the viewers can understand that. Now, these kind of paintings, though, which we can easily say are Gainsborough and Sargent at their very best, these kind of paintings will often make a critic or a viewer think, this seems to be a bit more about the painter than it is about the sitter, isn't it? Isn't he just kind of showing off in the brushwork? Or in a way, there's a certain generic beauty in their elegance. That is, it's not particularly specific, but rather more general. Now, in certain Gainsborough paintings, it goes a little, continues this vein that the name of the sitter, even when known, seems willfully forgotten. And there you go. You see, this is the Blue Boy there on the left. A minute ago, we saw the Morning Walk. Even though we know it's Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett, we always call it the Morning Walk. And this on the left is the Blue Boy, one of Gainsborough's most famous pictures, painting of 1770. And then here on the right, this was a advertisement for Pella windows. A precision fit replacement window from Pella, once again proving that you can easily replace an original. So, it's somewhat scary words in an art museum, and also this ad gave me a little challenge. The painting on the left is, as I said, one of Gainsborough's most celebrated. It's remarkable because that boy there, he's not a prince, not an aristocrat. He looks like a sort of young lord from the court of Charles I, something that Van Dyck would have painted in the 1630s. But his father was an ironmonger. His name is Jonathan Battal. His father was an ironmonger, which is basically like running a hardware store. So he's no prince, but he is painted, he was a family friend of Gainsborough, but he's painted here in this extraordinary suit with his sort of hand on his hip and a sort of great stare, so confident. Part of its appeal, in a way, though, is that he is kind of universal. Knowing that his father was an ironmonger doesn't help. What's interesting in this is that this is a great Gainsborough who's looking at Van Dyck. And we got that high collar and all those little buttons and the silvery costume and, of course, the loose hair, all things characteristic of Gainsborough's great predecessor. Now, the painting on the right, though, the advertisement on the right, kind of inspired us to do some research here. The painting of the Blue Boy was owned by the Huntington Library in San Marino. And this painting was not allowed to come to the exhibition. It has, in fact, never been lent. And when this painting was bought by Henry Huntington in the 1920s, it was by far, the Blue Boy, by far the most famous painting in the world. It was much better known than the Mona Lisa, for example. But since it's been in a somewhat out-of-the-way place for the last 80 years, its fame has lessened. And one of the arguments we made is this is the great opportunity to send it on a big tour. Come on, Gainsborough goes to London, Washington, and then Boston, or to be seen by huge audiences, and put this painting back on the map, not just as an important example of someone wearing Van Dyck dress, which was a kind of trendy thing to do, a vogue in the mid-18th century, and not just an example of how changes taste, how tastes change, but also as an example of Gainsborough's brushwork at a very high quality. So you can't easily replace an original, but we tried upstairs, and we found what we think is the best copy of the Blue Boy. It's a very interesting painting. You'll see it in that large gallery. And it is a painting by, we think, by the British artist John Hopner, who was just a little bit younger than Gainsborough, and in fact owned the original Blue Boy, and the painting has the same dimensions. And this painting, back in the 20s and 30s, rivaled the Blue Boy, that's the Huntington, for being the original. And so it hasn't been seen in 70 years, and we found it in a very obscure American private collection, in a kind of small town you'd never expect to have a major old master painting. But Hopner's copy of the Blue Boy is upstairs to make this point about Gainsborough and Van Dyck, which I'll return to in a moment. So, today I want to just think for a few minutes about the notion of the substance of style. See if you'll grant me some rumination time here. And it really is another question, is can we take Gainsborough seriously as a portraitist? That is if he is facile, if he is very talented, if he makes everyone look elegant, can we take him seriously? Now, he certainly took his own work seriously. We'll see here in a nice comparison between two paintings by different artists of the same sitter. Now, the one on the left is by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And Reynolds was Gainsborough's single greatest competitor. And indeed, their careers are so fascinating because the two of them came head-to-head on many different times, many different instances. And the differences were that although Reynolds was the president of the very prestigious and powerful Royal Academy, Gainsborough would do very well in the published reviews of the Royal Academy exhibitions. So he'd often take the honorable mention or the silver, or sometimes even the gold against Reynolds. Also, Reynolds was able to charge a little more money than Gainsborough for his prices. You paid by the format, and the price for a full length, a half length, or a bust length for Reynolds always a little bit more than Gainsborough's. What's interesting, though, is Gainsborough enjoyed a very important social prestige, particularly with groups of musicians and with the royal family. And there's a period in the 1770s, after he moves from Bath in western England, where he's the kind of center part of his career, to the capital, to London, from the mid-1770s to his death, almost just about before his death in 1788, when Gainsborough is the preferred portraitist of the royal family. So you can see these two artists are neck and neck. You see also that they offer very different things if we look at how these two competitors painted. This is the same woman. Now, if you compare the two, only the one on the left makes it very clear that this woman was by profession an actress. Her name was Mrs. Sarah Siddons, and she was by far the most famous actress of her day. Reynolds on the left has painted her, and it's even in the title, Mrs. Siddons as the tragic muse. So she's a personification. She is like, the Statue of Liberty or Blind Justice. She, in a way, is lost some of her personality in the guise of a timeless and sort of abstraction, a theoretical idea. And she's sitting there on a throne, and they're actually very faintly, but you can see figures behind her. These are figures being actors or characters from plays up her head, and she's looking up, not looking at us per se, but she's rather looking up for inspiration. And what's important about Mrs. Siddons, though, is that Reynolds always wanted to emphasize the timeless, the eternal. That's not a real dress that she's wearing. It's not even a Van Dyck kind of costume. It's a kind of classicizing drapery that Reynolds preferred to make his figures look eternal, timeless, and something about them being classical. This is a great debate, because Gainsborough very much preferred, I'll get back to that in a second, to paint his figures in specific dresses. The one you see on the right, this is again Mrs. Siddons, and this painting was done overlapping, maybe just a little bit later than Reynolds, as a kind of response. Reynolds is one, she's got this kind of histrionic pose, her skin is very, very pale, and indeed Reynolds liked to take his cues from sculpture. And you'll see that again and again in Reynolds' portraits. People stride around like Greek gods. They look like the Apollo Belvedere. And the pose, in fact, of the one on the left was taken from Michelangelo. Gainsborough wants nothing of that, was not interested in these kind of personifications at all. And what you imagine here, we're not looking up at Mrs. Siddons like we are with Reynolds, but with this picture by Gainsborough, what we're doing is it's almost as if we pulled up a chair. We're sitting right next to her. So it's very intimate. Now, where Reynolds has Mrs. Siddons wearing this generic drapery that's timeless, this was up-to-date fashion 1785. And so what Gainsborough is doing is painting her as a beautiful woman. And you can kind of have the feeling that as he paints the beautiful fur muff there and all the stripes that make up her costume and her delicate face and her soft hair and that amazing black feathers in her hat, he was kind of enjoying the physical act of painting, kind of caressing her. And I think that's part of the appeal. Gainsborough loved beautiful clothing, loved to depict it, and beautiful women. And Mrs. Siddons as a beautiful woman comes out here. If you prefer her as an actress, though, you'd want Reynolds. And that's some of the distinction between these two artists. They both took their roles very, very seriously. But again, Reynolds is more about her in her role, making the pun, as an actress, and here, instead, as a beautiful woman, much closer, much more immediate. And you can imagine her breathing and just turning her head slightly so Gainsborough could take advantage of her beautiful profile. Now, a minute ago we looked at the Blue Boy, and in the mid-18th century, as I said, from the 1730s to the late 1770s, people would wear Van Dyck costumes for special occasions. You'd wear them to a masquerade or a party or a ball, and this is the kind of thing, dressing up perhaps a bit like people do Civil War reenactment now. It was a kind of special thing. You'd go in this costume from a previous century, which harked back to a more elegant time, but you'd also, in certain cases, have your portrait painted in a Van Dyck costume. Gainsborough's indebtedness to Van Dyck was very strong. We have in the exhibition the painting on the left, which is a Gainsborough copy after a Van Dyck double portrait. These are Lords John and Bernard Stuart, who in fact perished in the English Civil War. The Van Dyck original, which was in a country house collection in England, was seen by Gainsborough. It was actually in Kent then. Gainsborough traveled around quite a lot looking for sitters, and he would of course study their old master paintings. And we have in the exhibition Gainsborough's copy, which you see there on the left. And this copy is important because it says a lot of things. It says, one, that Gainsborough looked to Van Dyck as his greatest predecessor, his greatest example. And he's had a lot of fun trying to get the slashy effects of light, these silvery costumes. The poses where we look up at them and they have this nonchalance, even a certain scorn. It's almost, they're kind of intimidating to us as we look up at these men. But these pictures, in fact, were painted by Gainsborough for his own use. They were not sold, but they were made visible to visitors to his studio. And lots of we have descriptions of Gainsborough's studio. We know that he had Rubens paintings, Van Dyck paintings, and then his own copies of Van Dyck. And to paint this big, full-scale portrait, double portrait of a Van Dyck, to make a copy himself, is saying that he is the heir, he is the inheritor of the greatest previous greatest British portraitist. And so you can read him as a continuation of Van Dyck's style, which was the benchmark. And we see in the painting next to it up in the exhibition this comparison, which shows how Gainsborough, having learned these lessons for the silvery effects and the dark backgrounds and the sort of the sense of aristocratic elegance, he applies it into a picture here. This is Isabella Lady Molyneux. She later becomes the Countess of Sefton, an important one from the late 60s. And what about here is so beautiful is how he's captured the transient moment. Clearly Van Dyck's figures are posed. We have the same ingredients, but now you see she's slightly turning her head. She has her hand touches to her chest, and the very elegant fingers, again, this elongation of body parts, typical of Van Dyck in the 1630s, becomes typical of Gainsborough in his middle career. Long fingers, and remember, always touching your heart as a sort of sincerity gesture. And so he's making clear here both that she's a beautiful woman, but also that she's lost in thought. And there's something, again, so elegant about Gainsborough that his figures seem not to work too hard. They're thinking and they're leading their own lives. The silvery effect of the costume, and then, of course, that we look up against her, that she stands out, looms forward against this dark background, all much very Van Dyck. Now, when we look at a picture like the one on the right, though, we can see where he's coming from, his copy of Van Dyck, and looking at great British portraits of a century earlier. But we see these people with their upswept hair and their very elegant expressions, and we wonder, are these accurate portraits? It seems, if you think that Gainsborough and Van Dyck are quite similar, and it's clear Gainsborough wanted to be thought of as the next Van Dyck, and you look at paintings like this and you can see how close they are, it seems with this kind of comparison that these artists are taking real liberties with their sitters in order to flatter them. And that's a reasonable assumption, but what's kind of remarkable, and I don't really know how to explain that, is that Gainsborough in his own time was seen as the most accurate portrait painter in England. That is, he had an ability to render a likeness that none of his competitors had. Reynolds, we saw a minute ago on the left, made everyone look a bit like a statue. They had that, it was nice to be statuesque, but there was something a little bit unnatural. Didn't look quite like them. Gainsborough, on the other hand, though, was credited by his contemporaries. We have many letters that describe this, and people remarking on this, how accurate, how his people really looked like the sitters. Now, this is something we have to keep in mind before we dismiss him as being another shallow society portraitist who is merely flattering his sitters. I want to think again, though, for the idea of substance and style. This talk is called The Substance of Style, and we think of substance and style as being two things that are related, that is proportionally related. That is, if you have a lot of style, you can't have much substance, and vice versa, that we are good at one at the expense of the other. And this is often applied to politicians, for example, with the dilemma being that either someone is slick and empty or they are very diligent but dull. And, someone that could be both, have substance and style seems to have gone long ago, disappeared perhaps in a past generation. Now, also let's think about the word style. As style is hard to define, but it's clearly that something that someone has. You can say admiringly, oh, she's got style. And style also can be more specific. It can be a specific style, a certain look. And you can talk about period style, for example. And in art history, we spend a lot of time thinking not just about period style or the style of a certain school that is a certain area. We spend a lot of time thinking about the artist's specific style. That is the literal hand of the artist, how that person conveys a certain appearance and how that style is consistent. We talk in art history about connoisseurship, which is the study of art based on visual characteristics. That is not using documents or a library, but merely looking at something and seeing what the making of it and its condition tells us. And in many cases, you can tell a lot about something just by its style. You say, this is an 18th century portrait. It looks a lot like it was done from the costume in the mid-18th century based on Van Dyck styles. And, in fact, from the handling of the face or the extraordinary black mantle she has around her shoulders, that's clearly a Gainsborough. If a work doesn't look right, if it doesn't have the hallmarks of that style, we would say it may not be by that artist. And we can go even further when we talk about style, and we say that it can be subdivided. You can talk about Titian's late style or an artist's signature style. And that's another interesting concept because, unlike most 19th century artists, and certainly many 20th century, very, very few of Gainsborough's paintings were signed. And from the painting on the right, and when you see the exhibition upstairs of the other Gainsboroughs we have in our permanent collection galleries, I think it's fair to argue that for Gainsborough, his own brushwork was his signature. Compared to Reynolds, who was so tight, and these faces looking very stony with these elegant poses, Gainsborough's figures are loose, but part of that looseness comes from the loose application of paint. And I think for Gainsborough, his style was clearly successful. He was able to keep raising his prices, and he was second only to Reynolds. But his style, of course, is predicated on his brushwork, and that would serve as his signature. Now, what is serious, though, substantial in Gainsborough's work, I think, is his physical presence of his hand working. By that I mean his work in paint, his exploitation of the medium. To go back a little bit in art history, remember that in the Italian Renaissance, all the greatest painters traditionally began as fresco painters. They would paint walls and ceilings of palaces, particularly churches, and there's something very manly. Indeed, Michelangelo went on and all about how fresco really challenged the artist, because you're painting in West plaster, and you've got to do it on a scaffolding, and it's dripping down on your face, and you've got to go fast, because as you're painting, the plaster's drying, and so you've got to race and finish that day's patch before it dries. Meanwhile, though, in northern Italy, in Venice, you had artists who realized that fresco just wasn't working. It's too humid there. It's a city built on water with canals everywhere. The fresco plaster never properly set, and so artists began to use large-scale canvases as a way of covering walls. First canvas paintings right around 1500 were covered with a heavy layer of gesso, kind of a plaster, to make it fresco smooth. But in that period, Titian, we'll see in a minute, also realizes, though, that the canvas is a surface that can be exploited. That is, a canvas is a texture, and you can have fun with that. And you can drag a wet brush of oil, not using plaster anymore, drag a wet brush of oil across the canvas, and the paint is only picked up on the higher weave of the canvas, not the lower ones. So you can do certain effects and make the paint surface much more lively and indeed much less smooth. And so this is really key, is that certain later painters want to be colorists. They want to exploit the big brush work. They want to exploit the loose stroke and put themselves, indeed, as I said, as like a signature right into their pictures. And if Reynolds is always one, more emphasis on the design, on the pose, on the outline, on the contour, what's remarkable about Gainsborough is he's the opposite. He is particularly interested in being indistinct and how these effects, at their best, make the painting look very lively. It's almost like she's shimmering right in front of us. Go ahead to kind of an extraordinary comparison. There we go. This is Mrs. Elliot, and or also Grace Dalrymple. Her expression, her beautiful clothing, the extraordinary mood of this picture would make you think that she's a princess. She was nothing of the sort. She was really a courtesan, but what Gainsborough had the talent of doing was to ennoble anyone. You could have your father be an ironmonger, or you could be a courtesan, but Gainsborough had a skill in making people look incredibly confident. Again, the same ideal of effortlessness. And you see here in this detail, which is just remarkable is what he's done is painted with almost an alarming freedom. You have this big slash here, which makes up that big white slash at the right, which is the way that you have light falling on this fold here, and then very tiny dots there, which make up a kind of trim. It's almost reckless how quickly Gainsborough is painting with that. And we'll see here what he's, I think, taking his cue from are great painters of the previous century who were also similarly evocative, quick-working, free in their brushstrokes. This is Velázquez, 1644. And though I would think, in comparison, that Velázquez looks relatively tame. He is not quite as reckless, not as quick with the brushstrokes as Gainsborough is in Mrs. Elliot. And you see this particularly in the section around the bottom. Clearly, great portrait painters know that we tend, the viewer, to focus attention on the face, whereas the body can be left a little looser. But what you see in Gainsborough is the beginning again of this game, this magic trick, that where some sections are very, very precise, other ones are left incredibly loose. You see this particularly at the bottom of that. It's remarkable just how loose he has painted this. So, let's return. Why is he painting this so free? Maybe in part he's a little bored. Remember, he has to paint portraits to support himself. On more than one occasion, he calls the problem of being a portrait painter the, quote, cursed face business. It was something that you kind of couldn't really get out of. It was needed to pay the bills. But I think it's much more than that. For Gainsborough, I think brushwork was a game, a way of showing off to fellow artists and also to art critics. Remember that with these new exhibitions that begin in the 1760s, the Society of Artists and the Royal Academy, you have annual exhibitions where artists are sending their new pictures to be shown to the public. And you now have newspaper articles, newspaper reviews of this. And connoisseurs, critics, people in the know like to have a challenging picture. Not have everything spelled out for them, but rather some parts be left quite vague, indeed extremely loosely painted. And as you can see when you look at a picture like this, a painting with loose brushwork, rather than having everything delineated, makes us, the viewer, much more active. We're no longer passive. It's not all told for us. It's not spoon-fed in a sense. We have to run our eyes over the surface and make the figures work together, make the parts come together, blend the colors in our own eyes. Now, this doesn't come out of nowhere, as I said, in the history of art. We go back to Renaissance Venice. This is a late painting by Titian, we'd say in his late style, and it's the Annunciation. It's a remarkable painting in the Church of San Salvador in Venice. I mean, the joke I like to make about it is nothing to do with the brushwork, but rather with the action of the Virgin Mary, in that she is receiving the most surprising news in the history of the world, and she is not willing to lose her place in the book. But to leave that aside for the moment, you can see as the angel comes in there on the left, and you see here in this detail, what you'll notice is that Titian here, paintings the early 1560s, is painting with a new type of brushwork. It's not all delineated. In fact, you're hard-pressed to find a single contour. Look at the way the hands are done. That's, I think, most extraordinary. You see finger, and then you suddenly see it just disappear. It just dissipates in a kind of smokiness. There's even an Italian word for this, sfumato. It's the same word as fumigate, root word. And sfumato means a kind of smoky or hazy edging. So instead of having a strong outline, like a coloring book, everything is very soft. You see that in extraordinary the hands or the arms. And the way you get to this effect is by doing hundreds of small caressing brush strokes. You don't draw a straight line. That's just too literal. There's no art in that. Instead, you caress and do it very slowly. Almost in a way, the best part, though, is the very thick brushwork that makes up the angel's wing. It's so thick, it's almost like a putty, or maybe some sort of typewriter correction fluid, whiteout, stuck on there. Very, very three-dimensional. And it's very active. And so from a distance, this abstract passage made up with kind of aggressive slashes of paint looks like fluttering feathers. And also, let's go back there, and you can see there's a certain similar freedom in the way. It seems very quick between Gainsborough and Titian. Now, Gainsborough never goes to Italy. He never does the grand tour. Reynolds is there for a long time, and much of Reynolds' enthusiasm for statues and quotations from Michelangelo comes from that period. But Gainsborough would have seen paintings in the houses of his sitters, and we just looked at these two Venetian examples, and I want to show two later ones, these are post-Gainsborough, which seem to be artists working in the same vein. Artists who love to play with the substance of painting. They make the substance be their style. On the left, these are both paintings upstairs in the museum. The one on the left is The Fall of the Rhine at Schaffhausen by Turner in about 1805-6. And then, of course, famous late Monet, the Cathedral of Rouen. Now, the key thing in both of these, though, is that nothing is completely spelled out. Even the comparatively finished passages in the Turner are quite loose. In fact, there's basically nothing that you call traditionally, conventionally finished in the Monet. But the point, though, is up close, you really see the paint. You don't see the painting. And that is very exciting. We're up kind of where the artist would have been, looking up close at the process of it. Again, this is a magician who doesn't mind. These are all magicians who don't mind that we know how the magic trick is being done. Certain sections in Turner, though, quite remarkable, that waterfall coming down is so free, hard to believe that it's actually a real place because it is so loose. But let me show you two Gainsboroughs here. This is a detail on the right. We see it's a detail of the central group there on the left. And this is a painting called The Harvest Wagon, which is smack dab in the middle of his landscape production. What's important about this painting, he sends it to an exhibition in 1767, so it's an example of public Gainsborough. And so, because he sent it to an exhibition, we know that it's not unfinished. It's so loose, though, very loosely painted. The human figures now come to the fore. Early Gainsboroughs, we see little teeny people that seem to be kind of crawling around Dutch landscapes. By the time of The Harvest Wagon, in the middle of his career, now we've got a blonde or kind of golden palette, and the human figures there's a strong composition, these interlocked figures, and so what he's doing, though, is taking a tight composition but breaking it up through the brushstrokes. And the trees, which are so minute and minutely painted in early Gainsborough, become very, very loose as he gets older and also becomes more confident. And this illustrates something that I think is another paradox, that as Gainsborough gets older, he becomes freer, but also more controlled at the same time. He's able to say more with fewer brushstrokes. He's able to convey more with more general, more broad, more indistinct brushwork. Now, I think it's important in this, though. Why is he painting this in such a loose manner? Part of it may be, in fact, that the figures, he's trying to show off the effects of light, the dappled light as it comes through the trees, but also, I think, as we saw a minute ago with Mrs. Elliot, I think part of this may be to induce the idea of motion. That is, as these women are walking or standing, turning their body subtly, the clothes are slowly rustling back and forth. Or we can see in pictures like this, we can almost hear the swaying of the trees or the wind passing through this. Or people being helped up, or in the top you see these are two men who are arguing over a barrel. Clearly contains something very delicious, but there's a sense of restlessness in this, a sense of motion, the horses that are sort of neighing and bucking back and forth at the front. And I think in these late pictures, you'll find these both in the last room of the show. Again, the morning walking on the right, and then on the left, an extraordinary drawing done at the same period. Not a portrait drawing, probably designed for a large picture of fashionable women strolling along the banks of a garden. So in a way, they're very similar in mood, but one is a portrait and one is not. But the key thing in this, though, is how loose they're painted. And I think maybe Gainsborough, besides trying to have fun with the medium, trying to really work chalk like he's working oil paint, besides making us very active and not passive viewers, making us blend the colors together, I think we should consider that Gainsborough is trying to add some temporal element to the painting. That is, in this you can imagine, as I said before, the rustling of the trees or the swaying of the silk in the body as it moves over. In no Gainsboroughs, particularly not in his drawings like this on the left, do you have much sense of the body underneath. He's not an artist who spent a lot of time doing nudes and anatomy studies. But what's important, though, is the surface effects, the glimmering effects of light, and the sense of the beauty of the fabric. And I think the motion of the fabric is very key in this. Now, this picture here is an early Gainsborough. I want to talk just for a minute before I finish about his working methods. Now, we have there on the right is an artist's doll. It's called a lay figure. It's a type of little mannequin. It'll be about this big. Not many of these things survive. But what you'll see on the picture on the left is that we have three men. These are the three friends. The guy on the left, actually, is one of Gainsborough's very few American sitters. He came from a South Carolina family and was living near Gainsborough, where Gainsborough comes from in Suffolk, in southeast England. But notice the figure on the left, in the painting on the left, he's got kind of lifeless hands and these crossed legs. There seems to be no vitality in the body. And that is clearly Gainsborough, who was looking and using a mannequin as his model. He would have painted the faces from life, and then afterwards he would have touched up the costumes, the musical instrument, the flute he's playing, the landscape in his own studio. And so in a way, early Gainsborough is still relying, he's not confident enough. He's got this great eye, but his hand isn't yet confident. And part of the beauty of the exhibition is to see his hand catch up with his eye. And finally, in the last room, his hand takes over, and he becomes so confident. But early Gainsborough is using these kind of crutches. And the effect, you can see the guy on the left is somewhat lifeless, indeed, doll-like. But this is the kind of typical aid that an artist would use. We also know that Gainsborough would begin painting his portraits in a kind of darkened room. That is, he had very complicated shutters in his studios in Bath and then later in London, where he could have as much light or as little light as he wanted. Like all artists, he preferred a north-facing studio, which lent in not a sharp light, but rather a diffused light. But what he would do is he'd have a sitter come in and then make the room quite dark. Part of this, I think, was to make the experience of having your portrait painted somewhat mysterious. Again, this magician element. But what Gainsborough would do, that was with less light, it'd be less distracting. If you were to paint somebody and the light is quite bright, you might think about the smallest details of her hair or the shape of the eyeglasses or something. But if you just have fewer indications of the actual appearance, because the room is not so bright, you concentrate on the most important things, the proportion, the sort of broad contours of the body. Now, we also know Gainsborough, interestingly, liked to think a lot about the intended position of the viewer. And we know that he used, in certain cases, particularly as a later painter in his later career, 6-foot-long brushes. And these are very, very long brushes. Don't think of these as kind of brooms, but rather think of these actually, I think, as fishing poles. Imagine something very, very light with a little brush at the end. Now, why would he use a 6-foot brush? Well, the reason is it meant that he could have the sitter model posing for him, then he could have the canvas, and he could stand back and be equal distant from the sitter and the canvas. That is, have the sitter and the canvas next to each other, and he could stand back, and which means he could judge his painting as it would be seen by someone, by the ideal viewer from a few feet away, which is a remarkable idea. Now, it takes a lot of patience and probably very strong wrists to do that, but what Gainsborough, I think, saw in this is that his game, this salad of strokes that he was doing, he could judge their effect by distance. We also know that he would leave canvases quite loosely stretched on the stretcher, so if he wanted to, he could move the canvas on front back and forth. That is, if the person's head were right in the middle of the picture, but he wanted to have it right next to the actual face, he would unloosen. Let's talk about the one on the left, for example, which is every famous picture of Anne Ford in 1760. It's got every indication of being begun in a darkened room, because you can see he's very interested in the effect of the body looming out. But just say she was sitting there next to the head, and what Gainsborough could have done is then loosened the string on the back holding this, and then slid the painting kind of on the side, so it could be as close as possible to her own head to make the comparison as accurate. Now, I've got this here next to another very famous portrait, because in a way, the Anne Ford is kind of Gainsborough's Madame X. Now, Madame X, his name is Pierre Gautreau, but we don't really call her that. Again, like the Morning Walk or the Blue Boy, it seems the painter is much more important than the sitter, which again is a kind of argument about style being quite substantive. The important thing about Anne Ford, though, is that she is being depicted by Gainsborough as a musician. And in 1760, it was fine for a woman to perform at home or play with her friends music. You could sing or play an instrument, but you didn't do it in public at a concert for money. And what Gainsborough is capturing here is something of her fame or even infamy or notoriety. The previous season, in 1759, Anne Ford there on the left had done concerts in London for money. She'd gone out on stage as a singer and as a musician of the guitar and the viola da gamba. And this painting is quite daring because it's celebrating her as a musician, and see that great pile of music under her elbow, but also celebrating her as a beautiful woman and with her legs crossed as someone who is flaunting social conventions. So in a way, it's like the very low-cut dress here of Madame X. It's a woman very confident in her beauty, but also an artist who is taking advantage of the PR aspects of a somewhat notable or indeed somewhat scandalous sitter. Now, one final point we should make about his working methods is how liquid his paints were. The big difference between oils, a great advantage given to oils compared to tempera painting, which is what early Renaissance painting has done, is that oil dries very slowly, which means you can really play with it. You can build it up into layers. And that's very, very important in Gainsborough. What interestingly he does is he puts so much medium compared to the actual pigment that his paintings, the actual paint itself is very liquid. Now if you look closely at Gainsborough pictures, you see drops everywhere. You see bits that sort of just rush down on the sides. He applied something and then didn't, in a way, remember to clean it up. One of his daughters said that the paint was so liquid on his palette that if Gainsborough didn't watch himself and keep the palette completely horizontal, the colors would run right off the side. And we'll see that in his late paintings right now, just how liquid it was. And here we have we've got two examples of paintings and preparatory drawings now from the end of Gainsborough's career. The one on the right is the Haymaker and Sleeping Girl, and in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. And a great pleasure of the exhibition upstairs is we see it united with its preparatory drawing for the first time since they were both in Gainsborough's studio. And what's going on here, there's a little sort of story, which I think is probably worth repeating, which is she's a city girl, and you can tell that by her nice clothes, her jaunty bonnet, and her pale skin. And she's gone for a little day to go out into the country. She's kind of playing at being a shepherdess or a country girl. She's been picking mushrooms. You see that in the basket, but she doesn't need mushrooms to support herself for nourishment. She's rather enjoying the simple pleasures of country life, and she decides to take a little nap, just close her eyes, and she lies down here on a fence here. Well, then, as she sleeps, you imagine she's dreaming, and I like to think that she's dreaming about, wouldn't it be great if I were not a city girl, but rather a simple shepherdess, and I could, marry perhaps a simple shepherd and have a simple life free of the strictures and complications of city life. Whereas on the other side of the fence is this peasant. He's a farmer, and you can see in the painting, actually, there are bits of hay in his hat and in the rake. Shows he's been working hard in the fields. From his rustic clothing and his darker skin, he works every day in the fields, and he comes to get a bit of shade and looks out and sees her, and looks down and sees her, and boy, is he impressed. And he's thinking, oh, if I weren't such a poor peasant, I could, if I were a wealthy boy, I could marry someone like that. And so the two of them, though, in this meditation by Gainsborough, are separated not just by the fence, but also by the differences in social class. And this is a picture then by Gainsborough that's not, it looks immediately, it's just about, erotic desire, but in fact it's a kind of beautiful rumination by an older artist on the possibility, or rather impossibility, of young love. And you see Gainsborough, though, in this preparatory drawing, which is made with black chalk, how many changes he makes between the drawing and the painting. In the drawing, we've got a horizontal format, and by making it vertical in the painting, there's so much more power in it. That fence really separates the two. Also, there's something kind of claustrophobic as they're brought in. Furthermore, you have difference in age. You particularly see it in the boy, whereas to my eye, in the drawing, he looks like about 8 years old, and in the painting, he looks about 13 or so. So clearly, there's a lot more tension when these two could actually be lovers rather than just a sort of schoolboy crush. And then also look at the difference in the two dogs. In the drawing, the dog is completely passive. It's, sharing the dreams of the girl. But in the painting, the dog is in the bottom left looking very agitated, just about to bark. And in a second, in fact, he will bark, and this will break the reverie of both of them and confirm that, indeed, they are not to be together, despite maybe the fervent dreams of the boy. So this is a good example of these two, but what you see in this one, on the painting on the right, is just how loosely painted it is. And in fact, her hands are kind of claw-like. It was never left the studio, in fact. It was never sold. Gainsborough offered any painting in the studio, the choice of any painting, to his nephew, who took, in fact, this painting. It's a good example of the liquidness of Gainsborough. We can go even further than that if we see remarkable painting and drawing also side-by-side in the exhibition, which is a story of Diana and Actaeon. And Diana, you can see, she's right at the center, she's looking out, and there's the man, then he's leaning at the left, and he is a hunter. He had the terrible bad luck to come across this goddess bathing nude. And of course, in the Greek myths, the punishments of the gods are terrible and fierce, and so Actaeon is turned into a stag, and he's got his little antlers popping up, and in just a moment his own dogs are going to attack him and kill him. And you see in Gainsborough's study for it, at the left, you'll see that he's looking kind of shocked, the antlers are coming up, and he's looking kind of alert, and the women are kind of covering themselves up. But a certain change of heart happened as Gainsborough worked on the painting from that preparatory drawing. On the left, everything becomes much calmer. It's almost as if Gainsborough is wearing his appreciation of female beauty, as a kind of badge of honor. He's like, you caught me, but I'm going to enjoy this for just another moment. And you can see that in the painting, Diana almost regrets, it seems, having to punish him. That's quite a big difference. But what I want to draw your attention to here is not just the novel way that Gainsborough interpreted this myth. Instead of doing the typical painting of showing the wrath of the gods, it's a much more poignant moment here. It's a meditation, let's say, on beauty or voyeurism. But what you see here is that at the end of Gainsborough's life, his paintings and his drawings begin to look like each other. And that's quite remarkable. That is, there's no longer the distinction that a drawing is preparatory and a painting is finished, but instead they're both equally about exploring. They're each searching for form, searching for meaning. And we see that in these two. Both of them are equally liquid, too. If a drawing, you think of something made with a pencil or pen, what you see on the left really has so much of the texture and so much of the touch of a painting, looseness and liquidness and a handling, indeed, with a lot of brush. So, in a sense, the distinction between drawing and painting, both being preparatory and final, or being tight or loose, begins to collapse. I want to show two quick examples to talk about Gainsborough taking very seriously his business as a portrait painter, trying to indeed find substance in that. We see here two pictures of Lady Dartmouth, and they are done just a couple years apart. It's the same sitter, but Gainsborough argued that the one on the left was something of a failure. And these were done at 1769. This is about 1771 on the right. It's the same sitter, and Lady Dartmouth, in fact, wanted to be depicted, as you see here on the left, with a kind of made-up costume. No one really wore that around. It's kind of like a dressing gown or a bathrobe. It was supposed to look eternal. It was supposed to look timeless. One of the great problems in portraiture then as now is how quickly we look dated in our own portraits. Just think of a photograph, for example, just from 5-10 years ago. You said, was I wearing that? You can't believe it, how times change so quickly. And there are examples of Gainsborough paintings where he went back and corrected at the insistence of the patron and made someone's dress fancier or changed the style or added new colors or different type of buttons or made someone wider or thinner, whatever. So there's a sense of time, so specific time, maybe being the enemy of a good portrait. That was one important reason to advocate generic costumes, timeless costumes, classical drapery, things that looked vaguely ancient Greek. But when Gainsborough finished that, Gainsborough and certainly Lady Dartmouth's husband, Lord Dartmouth, thought it doesn't look anything like her. And Gainsborough, in fact, writes in a letter, he thought what he called fancy dresses, that is, things made that were fanciful, not the actual clothes people wore, was a deterrent. It didn't actually help a portrait succeed. And he said he objected to fancy dresses because they impede a likeness, which is the principal purpose of a portrait. Impeding a likeness. That is, when he paints her in the costume she really wears, then it looks like her. If people don't wear classical dress in daily life, they shouldn't be in a portrait. So that's another example of Gainsborough taking very seriously and insisting on real dress. The one on the left is the family traveling to peasants traveling to market. Very there we go, beautiful painting. And then on the right is actually a specific place. It's Holywell's Park. It's viewed near King's Bromley, and these are both in the 1760s. And this shows a country house, not the actual house, but the property of a grand landed estate. You'll see similar trees in both of them, similar colors. But what's particularly interesting is the very soft, gentle mood. And there's a quotation by a fellow painter from Suffolk, who's John Constable. It's remarkable that two of the great landscape painters in England were born about 10 miles apart, and Constable 2 generations after Gainsborough. But there's a very pretty paragraph where Constable talks about paintings like this. And he says, "The stillness of noon, the depths of twilight, and the dews and pearls of the morning are all to be found on the canvases of this most benevolent and kind-hearted man. On looking at them, we find tears in our eyes and know not what brings them. And that's interesting because clearly Constable is not interested so much in what's being depicted but the mood of this, and that he says the stillness of noon, the depths of twilight, and the dews and pearls of the morning. A phrase like dews and pearls obviously means he's interested in light, and he's seizing upon that as essential in Gainsborough. And of course, these effects of light are best conveyed through Gainsborough's famously loose brushwork. And I think Constable in that seized upon something that for me is key in this artist, that the two great contributions of Gainsborough to British art are to use this loose brushwork, both to put himself in the picture with that strong slashing style, to make the painting seem as if there's a little motion in it. It's almost stop motion, the rustling of silks or the swaying of the trees, to make us active viewers not passive. It's not all spelled out for us, but we have to work at it. And also that Gainsborough's loose brushwork is showing an artist who really respects the application of paint, wants to make the oil paint do as much as possible. Just like Titian caressing, let's say, the arms of the angel, I think there's a lot in Gainsborough, both in his sitters, his portraits of his sitters, and also in his landscape paintings, a very loving manipulation of paint, loving handling of pigment. So I think the emphasis on this, and also the ability to use this not very specific, but rather loose application of paint to convey the transient, to convey the momentary, I think that shows really Gainsborough at his best. So rather than thinking of him, perhaps, or dismissing him as a society painter, or one who would ruthlessly exaggerate in order to flatter his patrons, I think we should think about him not so much for the final product, but for the inherent process. That Gainsborough, who loved to play with paint, we see this in all aspects of his oeuvre, who loved to play with paint, found in his manipulation of substance the key to his style. Thank you. Thank you.